And I just want to start by thanking you all for being here, and a big thanks to Natasha, Dr. Holmes, for joining us for this conversation. I'm going to give a quick introduction of Dr. Holmes, and then maybe we'll she recommended that we kind of give folks an opportunity to maybe share something about themselves, maybe what brought you to this discussion, anything that you think might be helpful for us to know as we're kind of proceeding with the discussion. Um, so we'll do that in just a moment. But I'll start. Natasha Holmes Saidi is a partner, parent, sister, daughter, aunt, and friend, and the descendant of enslaved African folks forcibly brought to the Caribbean and Americas. She is also founder and CEO of And Still We Rise LLC, a mental health company located in Massachusetts and Washington State that is dedicated to dismantling oppressive systems, liberating marginalized people, and providing culturally affirming psychotherapy and consultation services. Dr. Holmes is a licensed psychologist who utilizes a liberation framework to practice from a psychoanalytic and trauma-informed Black feminist and womanist perspective. She has published and presented on the topics of race, class, gender, sexuality, intersectionality, intergenerational trauma, and engaging in difficult dialogues. So, big thank you to Dr. Holmes for being here. And yeah, maybe we'll turn it over just to the group for a couple minutes to see if there's anything folks want to share about who you are, why you're here, anything that you hope you'll learn maybe from this time. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm particularly interested in, are you kind of leaning more towards the private practice route, the group practice route, or you're just kind of curious about it all?
I can start if we want. My name is Lauren Gillier. I am currently a psychology intern at the Gulf Coast VA down in Biloxi, Mississippi. But my graduate school program is actually Pacific University out in the Portland, Oregon area. And a little bit about for my kind of general interest and kind of what I'm hoping to get out of today. I'm totally open. Oh, and this is Katniss, by the way. Apparently she wants to say hello and join in on the fun. Sorry if she gives any like death glares coming. Hopefully that's not the case. But I am just kind of interested in learning both more about private practice and group practice. I'm about to head off to a postdoc in neuropsychology. So also interested in starting potentially in the future, probably not right away, but interested in potentially a neuropsychology practice, but I also really love rehab psychology. And I'm also really big into like breaking down the barriers and taking kind of especially neuropsychology out of its like Western medical viewpoint and how do we bring it more to like a culturally applicable lens that also might fit into different settings and look different than kind of the typical way that we see neuropsychology today.
Great, thanks for sharing.
I'll go next. My name is Queen Adupoku, and I am in Northern California. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, had a solo practice all the way up until 20, right before COVID hit. And so I'm very much interested in building a group practice. I felt private practice, while wonderful, I felt there's a little isolation that goes on, and I really appreciate having other clinicians working with me so that we can kind of process and unpack stuff. We are a woman of color group right now. I mean, we're not excluding men. We just don't have any male therapists right now. But we are heavily recruiting one gentleman. I'm trying to get him on board, but we are definitely looking from a BIPOC lens in terms of our treatment, looking at speaking to people in their native, their birth language, and meeting people, through I want to say deconstructionist kind of lens to kind of unpack some of the I don't know, racist and just disenfranchised type of things. And we kind of, want to build this out more to be, there's such a huge need for people of color, um, clinicians that are using a lens that Dr. Natasha Holmes is using. So I'm very interested in hearing and how we can um, create our group practice.
We'll definitely be hitting on some of those topics as we go on.
Oh, Elizabeth, you're muted.
How about now?
Good.
Sorry about that. My name's Elizabeth. I'm a solo private practice owner, have been for several years now. Through COVID, transitioned to doing all telehealth. And while I love it, I'm sort of in a bit of the same boat that Queen was talking about. We're feeling, moments of isolation and really yearning for more more face time with colleagues. And collaboration and that sort of thing. And so I've been sort of playing with the idea of maybe growing to a group practice, but I'm admittedly very intimidated by the idea. I have a lot of questions about it. So I thought, what better way than to start to talk to some people who have done this and get their perspective and their expertise.
Great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amber. Amber Lee, but I generally go by Amber. And I just got my master's in somatic psychotherapy and am an AMFT registrant, just waiting on the BBS to give me those numbers. I am I'm in a weird place where I can't really practice alone yet, but I'm building the foundation for a private practice. And my long-term goal would be to have a trauma focused group practice that centers Black and biracial individuals. I myself am biracial, and it's really important to me to give back to our community and to also move at it from a space that recognizes the systems of white supremacy that we're operating in and come at it from a systems change perspective, which for me in rural central California is a little bit intimidating. I have a little bit of fear of the pushback that I'm going to get, but this is what I want to do. And it's important work. And I'm really excited to be here for it. And so I'm really excited to learn from you during the presentation today about different things that I might be able to implement on my journey towards that. So thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is super helpful. And I'm going to invite the folks who got their camera off, relax, enjoy having your camera off. I ain't going to try to get you to talk. But it's helpful to hear the folks who did share, because I was thinking that this might be more of a conversation around entering into private practice, but this actually might be more of a 50-50 conversation with folks who are interested in this kind of group space too. So I will be mindful of like making space for that as well. That being said, before I jump in, feel free to drop questions in the chat. Norma, can you help me navigate chat stuff too?
Yep.
And
definitely.
Then what I'll try to do is like pause at certain points of the slide and then kind of weave in the stuff that came in from the chat instead of waiting till the end. But with that, all right, let's jump in. Okay, I guess I can just get started, Norma.
Yeah, go ahead. So yeah, we want to know a little bit about who you are. So go ahead.
So where I'm from and what led me in the field, this can potentially be a very long answer, but I'm going to keep it fairly brief. So I'm born and raised in Seattle, moved to Portland for graduate school. Actually, I went to school at Pacific. I think someone said that they went there as well. And then I moved out to Boston. Yes. And then I moved out to Boston for my pre-doc and postdoc. And I stayed in Boston for a while. Worked in various settings, corrections, hospitals, community mental health, in-home, school-based, like all the things. And then in 2017, I kind of took the leap into private practice world. I finally opened my own solo private practice in 2018. which is in Still We Rise. And then in 2021, I started growing that into a group practice. I will say ASWR grew unusually quick. So I'm just naming that now so that folks can kind of adjust their expectations for their own ventures. But right now, it's a psychotherapy and consulting practice. Like Norma said, that's based in Massachusetts and Washington. I have a team of about 80 folks, and we serve about 1,000 people a year. So let me see about my training and what influenced me into going into private practice. So I'm trained as a clinical psychologist. My emphasis is in forensic psychology. That's the like professional side of me, if you will, which I can deconstruct at a different time. And then there's this other part of me. So I'm from a line of social justice, liberation, community activists. That's like what much of my family. And what I was needing was a space to bring those two parts of me together. And my training didn't, I had some key people who were involved in my training who helped like invite me or help me realize that a space like that could exist. But I hadn't found a space like that. So I needed to create it. And that's really how I found myself in private practice. I didn't plan to go into private practice, and I for damn sure had no intention of opening a group practice. So that was not in the cards. But anyways, I can share a bit about that as we talk about group stuff in a minute. Let's see. I'm like going back and forth from seeing people and seeing the slides. Okay. So if you are one of the folks who are looking to transition into private practice, I guess a couple of things that I would say, and other folks feel free to chime in on this, especially folks who have been in that space. There are some like great benefits to being in private practice. There are a few drawbacks. I think if you're detail oriented, you don't mind administrative stuff, and you're like a solid therapist who works pretty well independently, private practice is probably like a good enough fit, or probably be a good fit. I don't think, at least for me, solo private practice didn't take a ton of planning. I got mine off the ground in probably 3 months. I didn't have a business plan. I sort of stuck to two insurance companies. So some people, I think, make the mistake of getting paneled with a ton of insurance companies. Then you have to learn about all of these insurance companies and their unique billing processes and all of this kind of stuff, which is a complete headache, in my opinion. But and I was also mindful of the rates of my colleagues, and I use that to kind of inform my own rates, like colleagues in the area. The biggest tip I would say for folks who are interested in going that route is to have some kind of a niche, and to be ready to market yourself. So I think it's easier to build a private practice when you're on an insurance panel. But the negative of that is you're often paid less than what you're probably wanting to be paid. But it's easier to build a caseload, in my experience, if you have something that kind of makes you stand out from other providers. Let me see, what else would I say about that? Is there anything you would do differently?
Before you jump there, I do
Yeah.
have a related question in the chat about how you chose which insurance companies to partner with versus sticking to like private pay or sliding scale.
Yeah. So people are not technically allowed. What insurance companies are really skilled at is like slipping these clauses into your contract where you can't talk about your contract with other people. So often folks will not tell you what their rates are with insurance companies. And so what I would do is get into like these Facebook groups with other providers in that area and get an idea of like what insurances do people encourage. So it's ones that have decent rates, but it's also ones that like pay you or process your claims. So I have an insurance company who owes me $25K from November of last year. They still haven't paid. You don't want to deal with insurance companies like that. But so I would say you can kind of get a feel for in your area which companies are decently paying and have the least amount of administrative kind of headache. Yeah. yeah, that's sort of how I navigated it.
And what made you decide? Because there's, so many people in private practice now that just avoid the headache of insurance and stick with private pay. What made you kind of want to take insurance?
Personally, I have never been to a therapist I had to pay out of pocket for. And even when I have money, I don't pay out of pocket for a therapist. So it's really hard for me to imagine myself as someone who isn't taking insurance. That's part of it. But a big chunk of it is also most folks who I work with, the folks from communities I'm serving, need to use their insurance. And so it's nice to not take insurance. It's nice to have a few spots that are sliding scale. It's less of a headache for sure. It just didn't align with like the values. Now, I don't like insurance companies, and I can like go in on some insurance companies for quite some time, which this call isn't about, but I do see them as like a necessary thing for me to deal with so that I can have access, or folks can have access to the services that I'm doing. Um, so yeah, I also would add to that usually what I hear, to build a caseload with insurance clients might take, it depends on how well networked you are and what have you, but um, a month or 2 months up to maybe, it really should, I don't, depending on your market and how networked and all of these kind of things, your niche and everything, I would be shocked if it took more than 6 months. With a private pay only caseload, that can take people a year, sometimes a year and a half. So you have to be a little more like intentional, and you're really catering to a certain clientele. You have to be mindful of like the economy. So right after COVID, people didn't have the disposable income to like put towards, not everyone, some people. So there's like more fluctuation and kind of variability because of that. But yeah.
I think Amber's direct messaging me, and hopefully that's okay to call you out, Amber. But she just highlighted that it sounds like accessibility to services is a primary component for you related to accepting insurance.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, that's why we take insurance. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But I mean, to that point, I think the biggest drawback of being a solo practitioner, and I'm curious if other folks have other thoughts on this, but is dealing with insurance companies, because sometimes they don't pay, and checking that people have a lot of people don't know very much about their insurance coverage. And so you're having to do those insurance verifications in the beginning. And like in Massachusetts, there was like one insurance company was acquired by another insurance company. And that turns into a whole mess where their systems don't like talk. And so you have all of these kind of things that come up. But there are some companies, like organizations, that are marketing themselves to solo private practices. I don't know if folks have heard of like Headway or Alma or any of those. So those entities are really focused on taking care of like the administrative side of things for you. Now then you kind of have to decide, like, do the values of those entities align with your own personal values? And so they're like venture backed, which to me opens up a whole set of messes when you are dealing with venture backed companies in the mental health space. But I would say that they're like have a pretty big footprint in shifting the mental health landscape. So in the next couple, right now, what they're attempting to do is get as many mental health providers on their network, and then they negotiate with the insurance companies, and the insurance companies negotiate with them, which makes it more difficult for people who are in solo practices who aren't in those networks, or small group practices like mine, or like what other folks are thinking about doing. It makes it difficult for them to negotiate with insurance companies. So you kind of have to decide, I don't know, pick your poison, I guess. But that, I would say that's probably the biggest drawback of the private practice space. Yeah.
I just to stick myself in here real quick. I just am learning that anybody who puts a question in the chat, it's coming directly to me, so it's not showing up for everybody else. So I hope you all are okay with me calling out your name if you're adding a question in the chat. So but maybe before we transition to talking about group practice, Queen is asking if you provide or have provided group therapy and if insurance pays for this.
Yeah, so yes, we do group therapy. We have groups at the practice. Insurance does pay. Do they pay as well as I think they should? No. But I would say that if you have a group of maybe, let me think, and the rates vary by insurance company, but once you have like 4 or 5 people in a group or more, the rate can be fairly equal to like a 90834 or like your rate for a individual therapy session. So our policy is we don't start groups if it has less than 5 people, because financially we end up the provider, the practice ends up losing too much money. That's if it's an insurance-based group. We also do support groups, which are non-insurance based, and they tend to be like a pay what you can kind of model where we give a recommendation of somewhere between $25 and $75 for a session. And then people can kind of opt in that way. Yeah.
Do you still tend to get pretty good attendance at those support groups?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And sometimes we get better turnout for support groups because support groups, you're not limited to the state that you're in. Therapy groups, you're limited to the state that you're licensed within. Yeah.
That's a good and important nuance to be aware of for sure.
Yeah.
And how do
you can't have insurance companies pay for a support group, but insurance companies will pay for a therapy group.
Got it. Okay. So maybe also this last point on the slide, incorporating who you are into your practice. I think you hit a little bit on, I think the success of a practice partly, will depend on what your niche is and how you market that and how you talk about that. And I think in a lot of ways, how you're incorporating, your values and who you are into your practice. Do you want to talk a little bit about kind of how you, I guess for one, maybe just in the creation of your private practice, or if it makes sense to kind of talk about private and group practice, incorporated, your values and who you are, and how have you shared that? Like, what do you think has kind of made it possible to make it known? Because clearly, you mentioned that your group practice has grew very quickly, and that's not common. And I'm guessing a big part of that is because of how you were able to kind of market, the niche kind of areas and values and BIPOC folks that you're working with. So, can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's actually a little bit difficult to talk about because so my practice has been, we just had our 5-year anniversary in December, and which means I've been in this like bubble for the last 5 years where I'm able to show up in space as my full self pretty consistently. So I was actually just talking to a colleague a couple of hours ago about this idea of not incorporating myself in the space feels kind of foreign. Like I remember being in spaces where that wasn't happening, but it feels like quite some time ago. That said, so I have been involved in like community organizing circles quite a bit, and that is actually where I ended up marketing the most about when I decided to like shift into this group practice space, the spaces where I was already aligning with folks who are trying to do the same kind of work. And that's not just psychotherapy. That's like accountants doing the same kind of work. That's I don't know, client care people doing the same kind of work. That's all of this. And so like marketing through those spaces is really how I was able to share what was going on. It wasn't so much focused on like LinkedIn, for example. Yeah.
I don't think our field I don't think LinkedIn does a whole lot for our field. I don't know if folks have had a different experience, but
yeah, maybe for more corporate kind of positions that are mental health, but at least my experience has been word of mouth, like building relationships, having connections to the community, letting folks know in the community, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. Do you know anyone I could talk to about this? And that was the momentum. So I connect with this person connected me over here, and we kind of grew in that sort of way. Um, yeah, but it took time for me to find like my voice and to bring myself, like to feel safe enough to bring my full self into the space. But there was a lot of intentionality around that. And I think that's an important piece. And maybe this is a good transition into the group conversation. That's an important piece to the group and what makes ASWR kind of a unique group space in that I spent 2020 kind of laying out what it would look like to have a group practice that wasn't repeating some of the harmful systems that I had experienced as a therapist. And that took a lot of like deconstructing and like reconstructing and thinking out of the box and like pulling from different fields. Because in a lot of ways, at least my experience in the mental health field, it's there's a narrative of it being like a space for healing. I don't even think healing was part of the vocabulary when I was in training. No one talked about it. They talked about treatment. They didn't talk about no damn healing. And so it's like trying to develop a space that is like healing or as minimally harmful for clients as well as for therapists. So yeah, but speaking of that, so I transitioned, like I mentioned, transitioned into a group practice in 2021. And it was primarily because the kind of liberation work that I was doing, I needed to be in community with folks, like I think I mentioned a moment ago. And I was trying to find other folks who are doing the work. And in the beginning, I had intended to bring on maybe 5 people to the team. By the end of the first year, I think there was more like 25 people or so on the team. And then I just kind of went with it. I just kind of allowed it to go where it was going to go. That said, I'm trying to decide how I'm going to answer. I will say, because I know there are folks here who are thinking about going the group practice route, but I will say that the transition from being self-employed to being a small business owner is a pretty big transition. It's a fundamentally different like skill set, which I didn't fully appreciate when I started the group practice. So there's like this new stress of making payroll, of managing people, of developing operations and systems, particularly systems that aren't harmful and burning people out too soon, of not running out of money. That's my primary job as the founder and CEO of my practice, is making sure we don't fucking run out of money. And that sounds like it would be easy, and it's not that easy all the time. So group practice is a business, and I don't think most therapists are trained in how to run a business. And that is, I mean, for better or for worse, I think that's kind of the reality. One of the things that I had to learn pretty early on is like how to read my financials. And can you interpret your P&L versus your balance sheet? Do you know how to run your profit and loss in a balance sheet? And if you don't know how to do some of those things, I would say starting with, so my, in 2020, I moved from Boston to Chicago, and my partner had just moved to the States, and he was at University of Chicago, which is this Ivy League business school. But at the time, because it was COVID, it was all virtual. And so I would sit in on his business classes. This is low key how I learned all the entrepreneurial things that I needed to know to launch it was glorious. Like I kind of joke with him. He spent all the money on the degree, but I came out with the business. But
It's like a free education for you.
But it was really helpful because he's also an accountant, which helped me kind of learn some of our first dates was him teaching me my financials. But I think that's like a really important piece to how I was able to like execute my business, was having taken business classes, being connected to entrepreneurs, and not entrepreneurs in the mental health space. And then like learning finances. So and that's actually my recommendation for the folks who are thinking about opening a group practice, is to connect with a finance person first. Like literally, you could do this shit next. Sorry, Norma, I'll stop swearing. But you could do this stuff next week, and connect with find a finance person, connect with them, tell them so they can run your numbers. You tell them, this is the kind of money I'm looking to make. This is the reimbursement I anticipate, considering the area I live in and what have you. What size practice will I need? And then they might say, well, they'll have to ask you like how many full-time people, how many part-time people, how many like average number of sessions each of them are going to see, all of this kind of stuff. So you work out those numbers and then they'll tell you. What I've learned, because I consult with people regularly on like mental health businesses and group practice and stuff. What I've learned is that most people usually enter into this space because there's a chunk of folks who think they're going to make a ton of money doing this. And I'm sure those people exist. Those people do exist. But I don't think that that's actually what's happening for most group practice owners. And so if you run the numbers and they tell you you need a team of, I don't know, 25 people, and then you start looking into what it's going to take to grow 25 people and what kind of like investment is going to be required to grow to that size, then you can kind of make an informed decision from there. That's like my biggest tip when it comes to the first steps of creating or building a group practice. And a lot of people skip over that piece. I feel like I just jumped around a little bit, but I think I answered the question.
Yeah. Do you did you find financial folks or accountants that had like specialized in mental health group practices, or kind of what was that process like?
Yeah, so no, I still don't. There's a chunk of them that I have found. So like CPAs who specialize in private practices, which are nice. But the way that I was thinking of my private practice, my group practice, I mean, is was different. I didn't want them to be comparing me to other group practices. Like the framework that they had wasn't going to apply to how I was imagining what I was building. And so I didn't actually want to be with, it was helpful early on because like a CPA who's familiar with folks who are in private practice can tell you, these are the write-offs for you to consider. Have you considered how your own personal therapy may in fact be a write-off for your business? And unless that person has worked with other therapists, they're not going to know to make that recommendation to you. So stuff like that can be helpful. But I think at least my experience was I kind of outgrew that pretty quickly, like after the first year or two.
We have some other questions in the chat. How did you attract so many therapists to work at your practice? That question's from Queen.
Yeah, so one of the business classes I took was on how to tell, it was like how to pitch yourself. And part of having a solid pitch is being concise. So knowing what you're saying what you got to say, and doing it quickly because people don't actually listen that long. And then also being like your authentic self, and having clarity in what you're trying to do. And often folks respect like clarity, directness, transparency, genuineness. Yeah, and people tend to trust folks who are present in that kind of way. And so I invited myself to kind of step into that and be okay with me being me, and being political in the ways that I'm political, and and showing up in that kind of way. But it was I'm a very relational person, so it was often like connecting with people one-on-one, taking time to get to know people, being genuinely invested in what they're trying to do, thinking about how, okay, our paths have overlapped in this way. This is how our work together might look like over the next couple of years, but I know that you're trying to do this. So maybe I can support you in X, Y, and Z like after, and like really respecting and kind of honoring the spaces that we're coming from. And that was really important too, for me.
Okay. Would you say that most of the therapists that you sort of recruited were through that model, as far as like actually meeting them in certain spaces and kind of talking about that, or did you end up kind of posting the positions somewhere?
The first probably 15 people I hired, I sat one-on-one with and had these type of conversations and like connected in this kind of way. And then once we hit a certain size, it was really hard for me to do that. So now what it looks like is we post, people share with their networks, and they do like a phone screen with with my director of operations and then or my HR team, and then they meet with me and I have an hour where I tell them the story of the practice, the story of me. I'm curious about their story. We like play with how we could potentially like collaborate for a period of time or however long makes the most sense. So it's a very different way of going into an interview. And in fact, I don't, it's called an interview, but I like preface it by saying this is a conversation and I'm trying to get to know you, you're trying to get to know me, and we're talking about this space that's being created. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any, especially in thinking about, the population that you're serving, working from a liberation, womanist, feminist kind of multicultural framework? Are there any specific questions that you would recommend in that conversation? How do you kind of gauge whether the folks that you're speaking with have, kind of share those values?
Yeah, I don't know if there's specific questions because I honestly don't go in with questions, which I probably should. But what instead I'm doing is I'm getting a feel for if I would recommend a client to you. And if you're not someone I'm going to recommend a client to, then so that's like one thing I'm mindful of. And then the other thing I'm thinking about is are what kind of community work are you like, what spaces are you in, or like what are you doing within the community? And if folks aren't in those spaces, then that also I think says a bit about how good of a fit or whether or not it might work.
A couple other questions in the chat. Do you do for-profit or nonprofit?
So ASWR is a for-profit entity. The reason I went the for-profit route is because I wanted to implement a model where there's profit sharing. And nonprofits, you can't really do like a profit sharing kind of model. And so that was part of it. Also, we're on track to shift into a co-op in the next 10 years, which means it's like community owned. And yeah, that's a model that I would encourage people to look into too, is this kind of co-op model.
Sounds great. I think you mentioned like cost sharing. Another question was, how do you set pay that's competitive and afford benefits for the employees?
Yeah, so this is why I was saying that you have to grow the practice to a certain size. So if you're planning to have a practice that's under 10 people, it doesn't matter where you are. I don't think that's a lot of work and like really low return. It may in fact be a better model might be like a co-op model for something that size. When you're around like 15-ish people, you're kind of right on the precipice of being able to offer benefits and like solid packages and really be competitive. But how do we do that? So that's why the margins were so narrow for my company early on, is because to compete with other companies and other practices, you obviously have to pay decent, and the insurance companies don't pay decent, at least when you're growing your group, before you build relationships with them and start negotiating with them. And so 70% of what you bring in is going back out to your therapist. And if it's over 70%, you'll bankrupt yourself. So just FYI on that. But a typical split, and this varies across the country, you'll see in group practices are like 50 split. That's not that typical. I hear it's kind of typical in the Northwest, but I don't know how that's anyways. And then where 50% the going out to the clinician. Sometimes you often hear 60% to the clinician, 40% to the practice. And then depending on what state you're in, some of the taxes, of course, you have to add on to that. So it ends up being closer to like 67%. And then if you cross over, practices that are crossing over that 70% line usually tend to bankrupt themselves in a few years. So it's a sweet balance. It's usually helpful to have an additional revenue stream, to be completely honest with you. And so if you're exclusively doing psychotherapy, that's a tough business to be in.
Yeah. And in talking about that 50-50 or 60-40 split, so it sounds like most of your employees are hired as independent contractors then, is that right?
No,
okay.
Most of my team is W-2, so you also need an employment attorney. All of this adds up because you want to make sure you're not misclassifying people. That's like a lovely lawsuit if you misclassify folks, especially in certain states like California. You don't even play. I feel like you just have everybody's a W-2 because California gets you good on that kind of thing. But most of my clinicians are W-2. Most of my consultants are 1099. And the difference between the two primarily being W-2s, I have more control over their schedules and their hours and the caseload that I ask them to carry and all this kind of stuff. And 1099s, they just pop up when there's a project. So, we have a new contract with this city. We need 5 consultants, 10 people email, we pick 5, and then that's a 1099 kind of model. Yeah.
We have a number of other questions in the chat. Let me try to keep us on relatively on topic before we switch. Can you talk more about the benefits of going into a co-op model, both business and community related?
Yeah. So from what I have been learning and sort of researching, the benefit, it depends on who you're talking about it benefiting. So the founder and kind of owner of the practice, usually, I mean, the reality is we're navigating capitalism. Most people are talking about money. A co-op model does not benefit the founder of the practice financially. It's not set up to be that. It's set up to be collective community ownership, which is collective responsibility, collective voting rights, collective investment. And so in that, I think the benefit is it aligns with the values and the kind of spaces that we're trying to create where, the potential drawbacks are to get a co-op off the ground. I mean, you could start a co-op with the group that you're planning on having like involved in running it. That's different from what I did. I started it with myself, got it off the ground, and then transitioned into that. So there's a couple of different models, but I think the biggest benefit for us is that it aligns with values and there's a collective kind of ownership. And the reality is wealth within marginalized communities is often built through like business ownership. And so having people be able to be a part of a business can help build wealth within communities. Yeah. What was the other side of that? Did I answer both sides of that question, Norma?
So the question was, can you talk more about benefits of going into a co-op model, both business and community related? So I think you hit on both.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on hiring trainees versus licensed folks?
Yeah, I have a robust training program. So I think this year, I think we had maybe 7 or so trainees. And now those are the people who are students. We had about 7 or so students. We have a group of provisionally licensed people, so people who have graduated and they're in between. Of course, you're all therapists, you know what provisional licenses. And then we have our independently licensed folks. And I would say a nice chunk of the practice is provisionally licensed. And I'm guessing those are the trainees you're talking about hiring, because we don't really hire students. I would talk with an employment attorney about hiring students, but it gets a little complicated and expensive if you hire them as W-2s, because then you have to pay for all their taxes and what have you, and they're not actually generating that much revenue. So it's usually better that when you go the student route to just like pay them a thank you type of a like here's a thank you gift of a few grand or something like that. If you pay them. Again, it's part of our values to pay folks for their labor, and so we try to do that. But the provisionally licensed folks, I do think it can be a great model to bring them on. It also helps differentiate you from other folks who are competing in the space, because not a lot of group practices bring on provisionally licensed folks. And like some of these larger companies that I was mentioning earlier, like your Headways and Almas, you can't employ a provisionally licensed person as a 1099. And so you're not competing with them either. I do think it takes time to lay down a nice training program that can take a couple of years. And it's tempting as the founder to be heavily involved in. I know a lot of folks who are like founders of their practice or owners of their practice, and they're also clinical directors, which I highly advise against doing. You might have to do it initially just because you don't have the resources to bring on someone else, but it really takes away from you being able to do that key thing of not running out of money and of like insurance negotiations, because your clinical director is not going to do insurance negotiations. I have to fight with insurance companies every 6 to 12 months. And that takes a lot of, but that's part of my job. So I can't run clinical operations and also do those more important administrative things that's necessary for my team. Yeah.
I think, yeah, that's helpful. And that also hits on a question that it's actually not in the chat, but just thinking about that, you started as a clinician, or you are a clinician. You started, in solo private practice, transitioning into group practice. It sounds like now maybe much more of your time is spent kind of on the administrative side. Are you still doing any clinical work, or has that really just kind of taken a back seat?
Yeah.
And was that intentional?
It wasn't. I enjoy being a clinician, but I don't have the bandwidth to be a clinician and to run the practice. So I would say my first year, I had to carry a full caseload. So I was seeing 33-ish. When I first started the practice, I would typically work 12 to 15 hours a day. Again, this is unusual because most practices take 5 to 10 years to mature, and mine's kind of ramped up in about a 2.5, 3 year period. And so I was working a lot, and I was seeing like 33-ish clients a week while also building out the group practice. That was the first year. And the second year, it probably dropped to like 25, 22. And then by the third year, it started reducing. Now I see 1.5 clients, like one client and then a client every other week. But the vast majority of my time is like administrative things and networking in the community, making folks like aware of who we are and all this kind of stuff. Yeah.
I know you've answered some of these questions. There's a couple other questions in the chat that are, let's see. One is asking about how to find consultation groups or supervisors for people who are doing solo private practice. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, to be honest with you, if you find someone who is running a solo practice and it looks like they have their stuff together, like they're doing kind of similar service you're interested in doing, ideally they're in a different state. This really shouldn't matter, but sometimes people get a little territorial about some of this stuff. But they're based off their website, it looks like they're in similar spaces that you're trying to be in. They seem to be full. For example, you might have seen their names like pop up in Facebook groups a few times, this kind of thing. I would say if you reach out to them directly and offer to pay them for their consult time, a nice chunk of folks would actually be open to consulting about how they kind of launched what they have going on. Again, sometimes people in your area, like your geographic area, are open to that. Sometimes they're not as open to it. So it kind of depends on who you're talking to. But that's one way of kind of going about it. When it comes to being a group practice, consulting with folks, I think that's a little more difficult. But I would say there's a nice chunk of Facebook groups that are just focused around group practice owners in different states. and like areas. So that might be a good place to sort of start.
That's great. Are there any places where you recommend for taking classes or training on the business side of owning a group or solo practice, like specific institutions or programs you'd recommend, and any specific Facebook groups that you would recommend?
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to remember the Facebook group names. But if you type in like group practices in your state, you can usually start narrowing down some stuff from there. If you do Google searches for group practices and then look up those people's names or like LinkedIn, schedule a meeting with them and then ask them which group practice or which spaces on Facebook are they a part of or do they know about or like can kind of network and introduce you to. And sometimes people are also open to that. But the first part of your question, Norma, was
any places where you recommend for taking classes or training on the business side of owning a group or solo practice?
Yeah, I would say I think the community college is completely fine. Also, you could go through SCORE, which is a part of the SBA, like the Small Business Administration. They'll partner you with like a mentor who is free, and they tend to have a background. They have a range of backgrounds. So you have HR people, marketing people, accounting people, da da da. And you can just pick someone, get on their calendar, and then you have an hour to ask them all the questions your heart desires. And that's like a really great way of accessing like resources. And they have them across the whole country. So you can find someone in your state. But so you can talk with that person for like one-on-one stuff. I would say the community colleges and like an accounting class, like a basics of accounting is like a really great place to start. You also are going to deal with, if you have a group practice, you're going to deal with accountants often. I have 2 to 3 meetings a month just on our financials. And I need to know what the hell this person is talking about when it comes to my money. And so it's just helpful to know how to talk numbers in some of those spaces. So I would say like a basics accounting class is pretty good. And those like knowing how to read a profit and loss statement, know how to read a balance sheet, having a general idea of how to run QuickBooks, how to like run your reports, like these kind of basic things I would say is a helpful place to start.
Thank you so much. We have just a couple minutes left. I don't know, Dr. Holmes, if you'd like to hit on if there's any other reflections or takeaways that you want to share as we're wrapping up.
I don't think so. I feel like I touched on all of these as I was bopping around. So
I think I might be freezing.
Can you, I don't think you're freezing, Norma. Okay, well, I don't know if folks can hear me. But I think I touched on all of the kind of key stuff. I hope that was helpful. I don't mind staying back for a few minutes if folks have additional questions. I also don't mind like connecting with folks one-on-one. I can do like a 30-minute kind of answer questions, share, or what have you, if you want to send me an email and we can get something on the books. But yeah, I hope that was helpful. And thanks for letting me talk about my business. It's nice to have a space where you can kind of reflect on, oh yeah, this is what the hell I've been doing for the last 5 to 10 years. But yes, Norma is definitely frozen now. I think, was there anyone want to jump in with anything before we finish up?
Heck, I'm so sorry. I thought I lost you all and I was worried about the Zoom just shutting down and not being able to give any goodbyes. So,
No, I just did a quick summary and I was inviting folks if they wanted to jump in. I can stay on for a couple of minutes too, if that's okay, Norma.
Yeah, definitely. And we could definitely stay on for a couple extra minutes. And just before folks hop off, I want to share just a couple updates from POC Inc. So I realized I didn't even introduce myself at the beginning, but I'm one of the board members of Psychologists of Color Inc. So I just want to quickly share, you can see on the shared slide, we have another event coming up on March 20th. It's going to be a panel of of folks who are either on postdoc or current psych assistants or recently were, just to talk about different experiences. So exploring kind of options related to postdoc and psych assistantships. So that's on March 20th from 5:30 to 7 Pacific time, and that'll be via Zoom. Also, make sure to check out the website for Psychologists of Color, Inc. We do have a mentorship program. And speaking of, business coaching and things like that, that could be one avenue that folks can use. We will match mentees up with mentors, and you kind of get to build a relationship with a clinician that might have whether it's similar identities, similar experiences, who is doing things that you might be interested in doing. So definitely check that out. We also offer an EPPP coaching circle. And we're also always looking for new or additional POC board members or committee members. So definitely check out the website if you haven't yet. There's also a job board with some really great job opportunities there. So please continue to stay active with POC Inc. As hopefully most of you know, the real kind of purpose and goal and mission behind POC is to try to support clinicians of color and increase the number of clinicians of color in the mental health field. And I think some of the points that we've hit on as far as there being very few clinicians of color out there, and some of us have experienced that when we have looked for therapists ourselves, when we've tried to find folks that we might refer clients to, etc. So this mission is really close to it really is the meat and bones of Psychologists of Color, Inc. So definitely continue to participate if you can. So I will stop sharing my screen, and if Dr. Holmes, if you're willing to stay on for a couple minutes in case there's any other questions or thoughts that folks have, I'll definitely stay on with you.
I just wanted to thank you so much for coming to this space and sharing your knowledge and just taking steps to dismantle the gatekeeping that happens in our field. So as someone who's newly graduated and jumping in with both feet, I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks for saying that, Amber. I appreciate it.